Just before I begin today, I wanted to make mention to you all that we have, for the last 3 months or so, been hosting Elevate basketball here. And most everything other than high school has ended. And it takes a lot of behind-the-scenes effort of people who are volunteering to pull that ministry off. And it's really neat to see people from all ages thriving in basketball. But until this year, Pastor Richard Brash had overseen that ministry. And he went to become the pastor at the Glen Burnie Church of the Nazarene. So we were trying to think of someone who would take that role. And we asked Chuck Brogan if he would do it. And he volunteered and has been a part of the leadership committee and team for the whole Elevate basketball ministry this year, and has just been such a positive voice and person in that whole thing. And so I was just hoping real quick, Chuck, would you stand so we could thank you for your leadership? And I checked with your wife this week about things you like, and so we got you some gift cards as tangible thank yous from the church for all the work that you've done to help us this year. Thank you so much, Chuck. We appreciate you. Well, when I was about 15 years old, I decided to break a pretty significant rule in my family's household. It took a lot of time and energy and imagination and courage to get to this point, but I decided I was going to do it. I made this decision in a Walmart, of all places, looking at the CDs. Back then, you could buy your music on actual things. This was, I don't know if you remember, they were round and they spun really fast and played music. So for compact disc. I don't know if you ever, it's a long time ago. So I was looking at these albums of music that I was hearing on the radio. The first one was by a band called Matchbox 20. I don't know if you remember them at all. They had a song on the radio called Push. I thought that song was great. And then this album also had songs like 3 a.m. and Real World. And I love that music so much. And there was another album right near it too by a band called The Verve Pipe. And they had a song on the radio called The Freshman. And that song was just such a deep song of pain and struggle. And I didn't hear that kind of struggle about the difficulties of life in the Christian music in my household. And I was just really, really interested in this story of him remembering the pain of being a freshman and his girlfriend committing suicide and how bad that hurt. And these songs were moving to me. Now, I had liked the music that I had in my house. I had a spattering of things like Carmen, DC Talk, Audio Adrenaline, Newsboys, Rebecca St. James, who I don't know if I liked her music, but I really found her attractive. But there was this deal in my house. It was the rule. It was the law that we only had Christian music in our house and no secular music in our house. Please don't get mad at me for the rest of the story. So in this Walmart, I decided that I was going to buy the albums that were not allowed in my house and sneak them into my house so I could listen to them. And so I had $30 in my pocket, and I purchased the CDs, and my friend drove me home, and the whole way I'm thinking, how do I get this past my mom so that I don't get an inquisition and then ultimately end up in trouble? And so I took the 2 CDs and lifted my shirt, stuck them in the front of my pants, spread them apart, had a loose shirt on, and I walked right in, said hi. They said hi. And I walked right into my back room, and I was never frisked. And I came to realize I might be able to get away with more than I thought I could. I had to really think this through a little bit. And thus began my experimenting with sneaking secular music into the house. Now, we had a whole bunch of run-ins over my years about what was Christian and what was secular. For example, my mom heard an evangelist that came through town and was preaching against the ills of comic books. And my friends had begun buying and trading comic books. And so, like any early middle school boy, I just wanted to do what everyone was doing. And so I would get like a Batman comic book or a Wolverine comic book or these sort of things. And I just thought it was really, really neat. I didn't even want to read them as much as I wanted to have them almost like baseball cards and trade them with friends. And so my mom had heard from this evangelist that anytime something was colored in dark or the word dark was used, that it meant that evil was there. And so she told me one day that I had to get rid of my comic books because the evangelist said so. And I kind of knew the drill. And so I said, all right, I'll just sell them to my friends. It's okay. And she said, no, you can't sell them because then the evil is out there still. And so my mom made me collect all of my comic books and go into the backyard and throw them into a fire and watch them burn. This was traumatic. So, I have a friend who's a Nazarene pastor today in Oregon who tells a similar story that an evangelist came through town and the main thing that he wanted to preach against was Star Wars. Preached against Star Wars. And so he decided he had like first generation, first run, 1970s made toys from Star Wars. And he decided that because of this preacher's conviction, that he was going to get rid of his toys. Now, his dad was a pastor in the church, and his dad was like, Dylan, you don't need to make this decision. You don't, let's sit on it for a little bit. Let's talk about it a little bit. And Dylan said, no, I can't take the risk. It doesn't seem bad to me, but if it is bad, I can't take the risk that it is bad because it's just a toy. And so he destroyed all of his Star Wars toys and got rid of them all. Now, this was the kind of conversation that was happening in the 1990s, secular and Christian. There was a bifurcation, a dualism. There was that which was Christian, and there was that which was secular. And most everything was seen through one of those two lenses at the time. Everything, you make choices for secular, you make choices for Christian. My wife Sharice and I went to high school about 1.5 miles from each other. Basically, you just go down for a mile, take one right-hand turn, and you would be at her school. But I went to the secular high school, and she went to the Christian high school. This was the way the world was seen, especially within the church at that time. And that sort of language isn't used very much anymore. For a lot of reasons, it doesn't seem like churches are battling the secular anymore. So why is that? Why don't we talk about things in that way anymore? That's what I want to explore for these next couple of weeks leading into Easter. And the argument that I want to make to you is that because the secular vision has changed, no longer is it just a dualistic concept anymore. And so I want to, if I can, borrow from some philosophical topics. I want to read into the scripture a little bit and talk about what it is and how it is we see the world and how it is we can see God working in our world and how it is we as a Christian people can name that God is at work in this secular world. But the first thing that I want to make note about in our world today, the place that we're at, 2020, Western culture, United States of America, highly educated, is that we are trained to be suspicious. This is ground zero, academic, child rearing. We are trained to be suspicious. And then we're also trained to use the vast amount of information that is available to us. We live in the information age. We may even live post-information age. We are inundated with information, which invites us to be able to verify everything. And if you can't verify everything, then it's probably not true, which makes everything very imminent. It makes everything very, and what we're paying attention to, you've got to be able to touch it, feel it, smell it, draw a circle around it, see it, know it, and explain it in order for it to be true. Now, the last few weeks we've been talking about the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is Jesus teaching his people to pray. And he teaches them to pray some things that are really, really wild. And they're words that you and I know, we can recite them, but have we thought recently about how radical it is to pray at the very end, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors? That's an incredible prayer, and it's one that I think we all want to believe, but we struggle to believe. We struggle to believe it because we don't want to be a forgiving people. We don't know that forgiveness will be effective. And we want to do things that are effective. So for those of us who are believers in God, we want to be forgiven. That's desperately important to us. We know we have sinned, and we want to find forgiveness for that. And so we want to believe that God would forgive us. But here Jesus is tying our capacity and willingness to forgive people who have wronged us to our ability to receive forgiveness. Forgive us as we forgive. That's the part where it kind of breaks down for us. Because we want to be forgiven, but we don't want to be forgiving very often. And we have to come to a radically obedient place to believe that God is able to bring about healing out of our willingness to let down our rights in a transactional relationship. If we've been wronged, we want to prove that we have been wronged. If we have wronged God, we want to receive grace freely. We have to believe something radical about God's work in this world in order to pray that we would forgive as we are forgiven. I wanted to read another story, just a couple chapters after that, that points out to our struggle to believe and to really put into action what it is that God is calling us to. The story is in Matthew chapter 17, and it's the story of the Transfiguration. For me, if you know this story, it's a deeply difficult story to read and believe. For us, 2020, verifiable, we want to believe what we have seen. If we know it's possible, if it's a regular occurrence, if it sounds believable, we're all in. But we are trained to separate fact from fiction. And this just doesn't sound like anything I've ever seen before. The idea that the transfiguration would happen is debated among scholars, believers, as to whether or not this is historically accurate, because it's such a crazy story. And yet, we're invited as believers to enter in that something particular and special is happening in Jesus, and that this is likely a verifiable historical moment where God broke into our world as we know it and showed up in a profound and powerful way. Would you join me in reconsidering this story, reading it together? Matthew chapter 17, we're going to read verses 1 to 13 together. Would you join me in standing as we read the word of the Lord today? After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be up here." And I just want to read between the lines here, Peter saying, it's good for us to be up here because we probably wouldn't believe it if we hadn't seen it. It is good for us to be up here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Jesus, this has been a great spiritual experience. We are on a spiritual high. Let's build something to remember that it happened so we don't forget. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down on the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then did the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I love this story for so many reasons, but the idea here that Jesus' face would shine, Elijah and Moses show up, and the disciples are just like, yes, yes. We're glad you brought us along for this. We've been in that moment, I think. I imagine for every person in this room, we've struggled with doubt about God at some point, but we've had a moment. There's been something that we can't escape. A time God showed up in a worship service, spoke to us, called us, made himself known in some way, and that moment is hard to shake. And oftentimes I think we come back on Sunday morning hoping to feel that moment again, the big mountaintop experience where God shows up. And some of us may even skip church from time to time, assuming that this won't be the week that God shows up, because we haven't had that feeling again in so long. But look what the disciples do with this moment. They're following the very Son of God, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, and they're overlooking so much of what's happening right in front of their face. They want to memorialize this moment, but there's something about Jewish culture that needs to be brought to the front to help see what's happening here. Moses and Elijah are the two Old Testament folks, the leaders of the people of God, who are understood to have been taken up into heaven and not killed. Okay? There's no record of Moses' death, so Jewish lore is that Moses was taken up into heaven. The scriptures say explicitly that that's what happened to Elijah, that he handed off to Elisha, and then he was taken up on a chariot into heaven. And so these two folks didn't die. And they show up, they come down from heaven, and they meet Jesus, and all the disciples who are there are like, yeah, this makes sense. This is right. This is good. We're glad we're here. Whoo, praise God. And then the voice of God starts speaking, and they tremble, man. They hit the ground. What is going on? What is that noise? What is happening right now? And the voice of God quotes exactly what it says is the baptism. This is my son. I am pleased with him. It says, listen to him. Okay, listen to him. Okay, good. Jesus wakes them up, and all of the transfiguration, the big moment is past. It's just them and Jesus again. The instruction they're given is, listen to him. And so Jesus immediately starts talking about his crucifixion and death. Well, he's just been glorified with the two famous guys who didn't die. And he's saying, what sets me apart is I'm not getting the easy way out. I'm going to die. I'm going to the cross. And the disciples say, yeah, but let's talk about Elijah some more. Like, the voice from heaven just said, listen to Jesus. And they're like, let's talk about Elijah. Is Elijah, we're told Elijah is going to come back. Like, before any of this stuff happens, isn't Elijah going to come back? Jesus says, okay, well, yeah, that's right. People talk about Elijah coming back. He's come back. He's come back. You've seen him. Okay? They killed him too. But listen, I'm going to die like he did. Wink, wink. I'm going to die. I'm going to suffer as well. And when I suffer, this is the subtext here, that's when you'll truly see my glory. My face shining, that's nothing compared to me laying down my life for the sake of humanity. For every human man, woman, child born for the history of the world, their sin will be forgiven and death will be defeated by the way I give my life over for them. I will suffer and I will die, but I will return and you can tell my story then. And it says, then the disciples got it. Then they understood. He was talking about John the Baptist as Elijah. What? Like, the voice of God said one thing, listen to Jesus, and they're not listening to him. They're trying to have a completely different conversation about the theology of Elijah when Jesus is trying to talk about his glory truly being seen in the way he gives his life over. And if you want proof that the disciples couldn't quite see what was happening in front of their face, just fast forward to the very next story in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus heals a demon-possessed boy is the next story. And Jesus heals a demon-possessed boy because the father comes to him reporting that his disciples couldn't. Jesus had sent them out to carry on his ministry on the back roads of Galilee. And this man was desperate because his son was so possessed by a demon that he was having seizures and throwing himself into fires, and that pain and suffering could stop if Jesus would just heal his son. And Jesus is so mad. He gives this famous line, "You unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long should I put up with you?" They've just been on a mountaintop experience where they saw Jesus' face shine, two prophets and leaders of old come down from heaven, and the voice of God speak, and they still don't have enough faith that God can heal by their prayers. The mountaintop experience that they just had, the glory of God descending in their presence, disappeared from them just that quickly. This story seems instructive to us today because we live in a secular age and a secular time. We live in a place where we struggle with what to believe, and we struggle with how to narrate and how to interpret when God shows up. We struggle with whether or not we could be so bold as to tell this story in the public sphere. We struggle to even name God's activity as God's activity because we're not sure how people are going to look at us when we talk like this. And then if people ask us to prove it, we don't have a vocabulary in order to name it. And so we live in this secular age. But what's been helpful is this man named Charles Taylor, who is a Canadian philosopher who wrote about secularism. And he wrote about it in 3 phases. He says it didn't just come about, it's come in 3 phases. And so Charles Taylor asks this question, and his entire philosophical work is based on this one question. How in the world has humanity gone from 500 years ago, everyone was an unquestioned theist? There's no one who was walking around claiming they were an atheist. Everyone believed that there was a God. How in 500 years do we get to this point where even believers are filled with doubt? 500 years is not much time. And that's a huge philosophical shift among humanity. There's all sorts of issues of philosophy, anthropology, sociology happening in that question. How in 500 years does everyone believe there's a God to now where even those who believe struggle with doubt in some form or another? And so he began tracking the history of secularism, and he says there's 3 different rises of it. The first was secularized public spaces. Think about this as this. There are priests, that's sacred work, and there are bakers, that's secular work. That was the first rise of secularism, just recognizing that there was religious work and there was work that was not religious. Being a baker was a secular job. It was not religious. So there are secularized public spaces. Then the second rise of secularism was the decline in belief and practice. That's the world I raised in, and that's how we used the word secular before. Charisse went to a Christian school. I went to a secular school. DC Talk did Christian music. Matchbox 20 did secular music, right? This is how we talked about it, the bifurcation fully of what was Christian and secular, and we would hang that as an adjective on different things in order to name them as separate for one another. But already that era, that philosophical era has ended, and we live in the third rise of secularism that brings about this creeping doubt in people's mind. The main feature of this new context that we find ourselves in is putting an end to a naive acknowledgement of the transcendent and making all of our goals about human flourishing. Naivete is unavailable to anyone, believer or unbeliever. We live in an age of information, and information demands our attention on the immanent rather than the transcendent. So all of life is lived in this sphere. The ancients 500 years ago would look up at the stars and they would say, holy cow, this isn't an accident. This is too amazing for this to be an accident. There has got to be something bigger than this. And we today look up at the stars and say, where's my telescope? I'd like to see the surface of that. Right? We've lost our sense of mystery. Everything could be verifiable or understood. And if everything could be verifiable and understood, that which cannot be verifiable or understood either doesn't get talked about or it doesn't get believed and is labeled as untrue. It creates a skepticism within people. And while the secular frame has a great job of telling its story, the religious frame does not tell stories very well. We have assumed correctness now for thousands of years and have lost our capacity to tell the story. And so the secular frame tells a compelling story, and we then end up marginalized on the side, yelling, saying, hey, don't forget about us. We've got the truth. Prove it. We struggle to prove it. But let's be honest, the secular frame, they can't prove themselves either, but they tell their story so deeply well. So deeply well. But I want to say to us who are religious, who are Christian, who are believers, and struggling in this secular moment, that God is still at work in our world, but we have bought the secular frame in such a way that we're living under that narrative and no longer having eyes and ears to see what God is doing in our midst. It is very, very possible for something to be happening that our secular, scientific, verifiable eyes miss. I want to show you a video that kind of demonstrates this a little bit if I can. This video is done as a scientific test just to talk about a little bit about how humans struggle to see everything that's happening. So it's going to give you some instructions in this video, and I want you to follow the instructions perfectly, and then we'll talk about it at the end. Try to be as silent as you can through the video and don't react. Just pay attention and follow the video.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
So I know a lot of people have seen this video before, it's not a surprise. How many of you did not see the gorilla right then when you were counting? Okay. How many of you, the first time you saw it, did not see the gorilla? Okay. So when they took this test, they asked people on the front end, how good are you at paying attention to detail? 90% of people in this response said, I'm really good at paying attention to detail. And just under 50% saw the gorilla. You know the gorilla that did this in the middle of the video? Right in front of your face. Half of people didn't see that. And it's because we're only capable, really, of seeing what it is we're looking for. And so if the secular frame is inviting us to see it from just one perspective, verifiable information, how are we going to see the mystery of the gorilla walking through our world when we're not even looking for it? So, how not to be secular? That's what we're going to talk about over the next couple weeks. The starting point is to believe that there is a transcendent frame, that beyond which we cannot see, and that it's active in this world, and the only way you can see it is if you're actually practicing looking for it. Because you'll miss it if you're not looking for it. We're invited to participate in God, and God shows up in ways that sometimes are subtle and meaningful in our world, but we've divided ourselves so off from the work of God and the presence of God in our world today, we're not always clear about how God is working. And so I want to just read a story that illustrates the possibilities of how we can carry out the presence and ministry of God in incredible ways. This is in a book called The Pastor in a Secular Age by Andrew Root. He's a scholar for youth ministry, actually, but he's wrestling with this idea of being in our secular age. And he tells this story about a teacher. This teacher gives her testimony in a Bible study to her friends about how the presence of God came upon her. And this is the sort of people that we are called to be in this secular moment. Listen to her testimony. I had a powerful experience this week, and I'm not sure what to make of it. Tuesday, I was lining up my class to return from recess. I noticed that Janny wasn't in line, so I went looking for her. I found her curled up on the slide crying. I knew her dad had just moved out of the family house and her parents were thinking that the marriage was coming to a fast end. So I waved to my student teacher to take the class inside. And I sat at the bottom of the slide and invited Janny to come out. I asked her, "What are you doing hiding?" And she just started to cry. When I saw her tears, my heart broke. I felt called to her in some way like Jesus was calling to me. But it was weird because as much as I felt Jesus calling me to share in her sadness, I knew Jesus to be with me. Jesus was joining me even, and this sounds crazy, acting through me. All of a sudden, I felt calm. It was like in the smallest ways, but a real way. I was born for this little flitting moment. So I just sat with her and assured her that I wouldn't leave her. I told her that anytime she wanted, we could talk, and that I understood how hard this was, but that she was not alone. Her eyes said more than I could understand, but I had this powerful sense that my words, my presence, mattered. I took her by the hand, and we walked back to the classroom. And I knew somehow that this was the most important day of my teaching career. Of course, I've accomplished things that may seem more important when it comes to education or whatever, but I couldn't shake how significant this moment felt. And I don't want to. I felt taken into something bigger. I felt like this little moment mattered, that what I did in the world did something big, even though it was truly so small and quick. It had to be a God thing. After school, I found myself thinking about it again, and I started crying. That moment of caring for that little girl made my life. My little job in the dog days of flu season, full of God's presence. I guess that's how I would describe it. The first move of secularism is to say that there's a difference between religious and secular work. That's a move that predates any of us, but it's a move we still buy. God calls us to embody his presence, to receive his presence, and then to give it away. But we've got to have eyes to see what God is doing in our world. We've got to see our moments and trust God and enter into them, to see that God is active in bringing his ministry of presence and reconciliation and hope and transformation into the world. And when God moves, we're invited to be a part of it. But if we're watching what the secular world tells us to watch, instead of paying attention to what God is doing in our world, we will miss it. And we will wonder where God is and if God exists. But if we find ourselves in tune with God, seeing where God moves and where God goes, God may show up at the bottom of a slide in a child's playground. And that transformation may make the difference for someone's life, for all the rest of their life. How not to be secular? How not to be secular? My hope is that not being secular is having eyes and ears to hear that God is working in the midst of a world that's telling us that God isn't. Because what we have in this world today is this very strange dichotomy where all that matters is humans flourishing. Everything is imminent and nothing is transcendent. The end to the world in our cultural narrative today is human flourishing. Get rich, have people of the opposite sex, look good, have fun. That's it. That's all there is. And while people are chasing that like they have never before, we also find, on the other hand, that humans are not flourishing at all. That as we chase human flourishing, as we make nothing transcendent and everything imminent, and our desires and our appetites are all that matter, receiving all of the appetite to fullness that we could possibly have is not producing the flourishing that we assumed it would. People are struggling. And they're struggling because they're living in an imminent frame when there's something transcendent for us to participate in, something bigger than ourselves. And so the way that I want to begin practicing this Lent season, if you would join me in this, as we head towards Easter, I was hoping that we as a church could participate in praying for our neighborhood. I have a map that I'm putting up here, but it's also available under the sound booth and computer screen in the back. You'll see that this is our neighborhood. If you look in the upper right quadrant, you'll see a red dot. That's Crossroads. And we made a map of this entire area. And I want to invite you through this season leading up to Easter to join me in praying for our entire neighborhood. Now, I'm not asking you to be the Nazarene version of the Jehovah's Witness, knocking on every door in this neighborhood, right? But as the weather is getting better, if we could be a people who embody this good news into our community by praying for homes and people and families that we don't even know, praying that the church would find a way to impact the neighborhood and the people who live here, praying for our church, praying for the homes we see, walking up and down the streets of our neighborhood. And if you were to go walk a street, maybe grab a friend and get healthy together, right? Put in a mile, or maybe you live on one of these streets and you want to cover that. Come back here. The church is open most all the time, and take a yellow highlighter and highlight the streets that you've been. And my hope is that between now and Easter, our church, you see that there's highlighting on this screen, will have highlighted this entire thing and prayed for our entire community and neighborhood around us. Together, not any one person, but all of us together, Crossroads, praying for our community, and seeing and trusting that God will work in some way by us getting out of our doors and praying for those that God has called us to serve. As we end today, we're going to transition to a time of communion, receiving the Lord's Supper. And I think that's a great response to this idea of transcendence and immanence, secular and religious, that we're reminded at the Lord's table that God's presence is in the cup and in the bread, that the same God who came and lived as a man, gave himself up willingly to the cross, suffered and died, and was resurrected 3 days later, is active in our world today and invites us to his table. And we could receive his life, his forgiveness, his reconciliation in this table is a tangible reminder that God continues to be active in our world. And this is a great place to find that he does just that. As the pastors are coming to set this up, I'll remind you that it's flu season, so we're not going to do any kind of intinction right now. I'm going to invite you to stand up, to lead out to your left, to come forward and receive and return to the right. I'm going to read the words of institution beforehand, and I am going to say a word of prayer beforehand before we come. And that way you could just take it and receive it as you get it. Do not wait to take it all together at the end. I'm going to read from 1 Corinthians 11 these words. For I received from the Lord what I also pass on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it, in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." As you come, I invite you to remember that this bread is the body of Christ, broken for you. I invite you to take and eat and be thankful. This cup that you'll receive is the blood of Christ, which is shed for you for the forgiveness of sin. Take and drink and be thankful. Lord, would you come and fill these elements? Help us, Lord, not to take empty bread and empty juice, but us to receive again your presence in this meal. We thank you, God, for all that you've done. May we find reconciliation, forgiveness, and wholeness from you as we come to you today. Amen. As the band begins to play, I invite you to stand, to come out your left and return to your right.